Hello and welcome to it is another bonus episode for April this time. And yes, you might notice if you are watching the video that you can't watch the video because Dave's computer has just exploded, which means he's in a really great mood and is going to love everything I'm
No,
about to
no,
say,
he's
aren't
not.
you, Dave?
Oh,
Well, I know. So we've got to pin it down. We have had some amazing questions though, Dave, which might give you hope and solace and everything in the universe. First off, this I thought was a nice little quick question from Jay. It says, "Do we have any evidence of any dinosaurs, I'd assume small ones, having prehensile tails?" So did we have any like a little, I don't know, chameleon that could wrap its tail around something or anything like that?
no is the short version. No, they really don't at all. I can't even think of anything that's even very close. Dinosaurs as a whole had very stiff tails. Not stiff as in like rigid wooden board stiff, but certainly not very whippy lizardy tails. Of course, as you go down the tail length, or as you go along the tail and you get further out, the bones tend to be shorter. That means you tend to have a little bit more flexion going on, so they're going to be more flexible further out. But they're also not very muscular when you get to that point. So they're really not going to have anything like a wraparound ability, let alone any kind of grip or being able to hang or take weight or anything like that. And indeed, the ones that appear to be most arboreal, or at least the ones we think we do, are things like Microraptor and its relatives, which have overly stiffened tails because they then have these really thin bony rods to make them really stiff. So the one group that you think might benefit from it don't have it. Definitely don't have it. I mean, the nearest thing I can think of, there's a little thing called Epidendrosaurus from China, one of the Scansoriopter rigids, and that has the longest tail proportional to its size of any that I measured on the paper I did on dinosaur tails. And that as it's preserved, it's like in kind of a U shape. And that's more curly than any that I've really seen. But even so, it's a very shallow, continuous curve. It's not getting any kind of loop or coil to it. So, no,
It'd have
not
to
at
be
all.
like a massive boulder if it's going to grip.
Yeah, in which case it's a bit pointless.
Well, no, you could turn around if there's like a corner. You know, when you stick out your arm really long and you can grab a lamppost or something and spin. I don't know, but yeah, fair enough. We've got a question here from it's from Alicia, but it's actually from her son, which is, I know T-Rexes could get up if they fell on their side, but could they get back up if they were upside down? I don't know what he means by upside down, because he might mean that
I
it's like,
presume he means flat on his
literally.
back legs in the air.
Yeah,
mean,
but
I
it could
think
mean
it.
even worse with it on its forehead.
Yeah, I mean, I assume flat on his back, legs in the air. I mean, I'd imagine so because I'd think that they'd just thrash around and end up turning sideways. But I mean, a T-Rex that had landed on its back, I imagine, has had a hell of an incident, and it's not going to be very happy. It's going to be in trouble. That kind of fall is probably going to do it quite a lot of damage. These are big, heavy animals.
Couldn't,
Go on.
couldn't it have been on its side and then sort of flopped round onto its back in a sort of like
Yeah, so
cutesy?
John Conway years ago illustrated I think it was a small apatosaur on its back, like rolling in a mud wallow. And it's a really interesting question of could they actually do that? It wasn't a giant one, but still, it was an animal that would have been a few tons. And you think, maybe, because elephants can get pretty close and rhinos do that. But yeah, it's a question of just how they're built and just how strong the bones are in what dimension and how soft the underside is. I would imagine if a T-Rex hadn't been really quite badly injured by the kind of fall that left it on its back, and it wouldn't do very well because it's going to have a lot of weight on its lungs and nasty things like that. But yes, I imagine a few kicks and thrashes of the legs and swinging the head side to side would probably get it to tip over, and then it's on its side. And yeah, when it's on its side, I imagine it could get up.
Okay, all right. Got a question here from Annie. I work in the Small Dino Museum in Prague, Czechia, where two mosasaurids are displayed, and we usually explain to people they were sort of warm-blooded. They had a sort of stabilized temperature of their bodies, which is the reason they had to eat a lot. the most common question I usually get, which I'm not sure how to answer, is how do we know animals were either poikilothermic or
Poikilothermic, yeah, or
I said
homeothermic.
poikilothermic. Yeah, exactly. Or
Yes.
homeothermic, just based on their fossilized skeletons. So how would
Um,
you answer that question for visitors at
so,
her museum?
I mean, I think we've talked about aspects of this on more than one occasion, but it really comes down to those growth rings that we have talked about before. And so how far apart they are in the bone, which therefore gives you an indication of how fast the animal has grown. And if they're annual, then we know how fast it's growing every year, and that gives you an idea of its growth rate. And then we can compare that to what we know about the growth rates of modern animals. And unsurprisingly, crocodiles and lizards and snakes have a very different growth rate to birds and mammals. And therefore, you can see which side of that line, or whether it sits somewhere in between, that a fossil animal appears, and therefore get an idea of how fast it's growing, and therefore also its basically thermal physiology. So yeah, is it quote cold-blooded or quote warm-blooded?
So which way round is it? Is it if it's fast growing, it's cold blooded, or if it's fast growing, it's warm blooded? Which?
No, so no, you need to be warm to grow quickly.
Okay,
So
good,
yeah, so
good.
warm-blooded things, so homeothermic things that have a stable temperature, but by default that's kind of high, because what it means is non-varying. And of course, if you're warm and can control your temperature, you will be non-varying. Whereas if you're cold, when it's cold, you're cold. When it's warm, you're warm. So you're varying. So yeah, it's the homeothermic endotherms, which are the ones which can grow really fast.
But what if, like, you're in a really stable sort of climate? I mean, I though I say that, and then of course I realise nighttime happens, and of course things cool down at
Yeah,
night.
right. Yeah, even in hot deserts, it tends to be cold at night, and even in things like a really hot tropical rainforest where it's still pretty warm at night, yeah, 37, 38 degrees, which is the pretty normal temperature for birds and mammals, is above the atmospheric temperature from a good part of the day. So yeah, you can only really do that if you're keeping yourself warm.
Okay. Who should we go to next? I quite like this question. It's longer than it looks, Dave, if you're looking at the screen that we're sharing. Um, but this is from Pranav. What are birds? Would you define it cladastically?
Cladistically.
Like oh shush. What are birds? Would you define it cladistically, like all descendants of a common ancestor of living birds? I've seen people use that definition for mammals, or morphologically. If morphology, then where would you draw the line? Are animals like, oh my goodness, Confuciusornis and
Ornithis,
Hesperon? Oh, go on, you
ornithis,
say it.
Confuciusornis and Hesperornis. But it might be, well, I don't know, because it
Yes,
might be the clade name,
birds.
so it might be Confucius ornithiforms or Hesperornithiforms.
If they split off before ostriches, split away from the
Yeah.
rest of birds. So what are birds? Are they the things that descended from a common ancestor, or are they these particular things that come that have these certain morphologies?
So there's an old idea of what are called crown groups, which is all the nearest common ancestor of all living representatives of a clade and all that descendants. So you would have crown birds so as he said, you got the ratites, so you got the paleognaths, you got the Galoanceriformes, and you got the Neoaves. There's all of the living birds in those three groups. So it goes back to that point, and everything forward would be crown birds. For the record, I think crown clades are a disastrous idea. I think they're fundamentally unhelpful, and I think they cause more problems than they solve. And I wish no one had ever created it, and I wish the handful of people who are still using them would ditch them. But
Well, why?
you can see you're
Why?
desperate to ask me a question, um,
No, I
because
just want to know
I
why you hate them so much.
so
Because logically, when you just explained it, it kind of makes sense to me, and I just don't
right,
understand why it's an
because
issue.
taxonomy has more than enough problems at the best of times. And one thing it really has a problem with is stability. Sorry, Pranav, we're going off on a tangent. We'll get back to your question, honest. So if you think of something like mammals, so crown mammals would then be the nearest common ancestor of all placentals, which is the vast majority of them, all the marsupials, and then also all the monotremes. Well, we've only got a handful of monotremes. We've got the platypus and 3, maybe 4 echidna
Echidna?
species. Yeah, right. But that's it. So what happens if we have a disaster in Australasia, which is not impossible, and we wipe out the last remaining monotremes? Well,
Oh,
suddenly, crown mammals is different to what it was yesterday. Because if you define crown mammals as the descendants of the living groups, and now monotremes are extinct, then suddenly that completely changes our definition of crown mammals. That means every single paper that was published before now means something different to the papers published after that day, even though we use the same term. Or you have a group like, I think it's, now I'm going to get this wrong because I don't know my deep mammal clades well enough, but I think there's a group called Afrotheria that has aardvarks in it. Aardvarks is one species. We could easily lose one species and then the definition of Afrotheria changes. That's not a good way for discussing taxonomy and evolutionary history if 100 years from now a scientist goes, oh, there was that really cool paper on crown Afrotheria. Now, was that before or after aardvarks went extinct? Because if it's after, then it means this group. But if it's
um,
before, it means that group. That's not a good way of defining and discussing things. It's the opposite of that. It's really, really unhelpful. So that's my problem with
I
the
get
use
you.
crown. And then the other part of crown would then be stem. So you would have stem birds, which are the things we call birds, but are not part of the crown group. And that would then include things like Confucius ornithiforms, Hesperornithiforms, Saphiornithids, and other groups like this. But even that doesn't really answer Pranav's question, which is, well, where do you start with birds? Even if you split them between crown and stem, what's the starting point? And that starting point, and this, we've never talked about it by birds, but people have asked about what is and isn't a dinosaur, and this is the exact same answer. Yeah, we define it cladistically. We pick our 2 species or our 2 clades and go down to an ancestral point and go, that's it. That's where our definition starts. Everything above this is a bird. Everything below this isn't. But then from a pragmatic point of view, we then look at the distribution of anatomical data that we have and go, right, everything after this line has this, and this feature, and everything before it doesn't have them or has these other features. And then that becomes very, very useful when you find a smashed up half a bird in the fossil record. Is it a thing that could be either, because I said bird, but a thing that could be either, some very derived feathered theropod. It's smashed up. I've only got half an arm. Oh, but it's got these 3 features. And those 3 features are only found in the bird group, and they're not found in the ancestral theropod group. Therefore, this thing is probably a bird. So we define them cladistically, but practically we look at the anatomical data.
That makes sense. I mean,
It
I
does, doesn't
resent saying it I resent saying it makes sense, but I mean, I was hoping it'd be an answer like, there's no such thing as a fish type thing where you can't actually define anything, but
Yeah,
that's the
but
thing.
right,
So,
yeah, but that comes again. We've talked about that before, and that's the difference between scientifically defined taxonomic groups and common parlance, which causes its
yes.
own problems. But that's why dinosaur falls into both categories, because dinosaur, the common name, is based on the scientific term dinosaur or dinosauria. So they should be the same thing, whereas fish was not. And science has had to realize that
Yeah.
fish are not their own separate group and that tetrapods derived from fish.
Which is sad in its own little way. I think that the word birds, right, came to the UK to mean women because through America and Spanish, because Spanish chica, American chicks, and then chicks to Britain birds, and then birds to that's what I reckon
It
must
could
have
be.
happened. Otherwise, it's a weird thing that both sides of the Atlantic refer to women as some sort of dinosaur, which is interesting. So I've got
One from
a
Susie
longer
Dent.
question. Yeah, got one here for one from Erin. Would have ceratopsians such as, do you want to say that one? Diabloceratops, and Triceratops have certain behaviours similar to deer and elk, such as sparring and getting crazy during rut season. When I was younger, I remember seeing an animation where two male ceratopsians battle for a group of females, and I thought it was crazy cool. So, is this something that probably happens, or is there any way of knowing? What's your thoughts?
So that's the sort of thing that I think comes under more or less unknowable at the moment, but probably work outable. Someone actually there's a preprint knocking around about stegosaurs at the moment, which actually has some problems with it, but they talk about this possibility in that, and then what I read of it didn't seem to understand the problem properly. Which is things like Lex, which are male-centric displays where all the males come together and display or fight each other, and then the females kind of pick from them. All those kinds of things that you're talking about here in a rut are linked to certain ecological patterns, or at least I think they are. Leks are much weirder. I don't have a good handle on them. We might have a good handle on them as in science as a whole, and I just haven't read up on it enough. But
do you want to describe roughly what a lek is for those of us who don't know?
Well,
I mean, I think
did.
I know
It's
what
where
a
a group
lek is,
of males get together and all kind of fight or display, and then the females turn up to watch. Basically, that
Okay,
is a lek.
okay. That's what you mean by lek. It's just like, you know.
Yeah, I said
Well,
that
no,
a minute ago.
to be,
That's why I described it. And then
okay,
you went, "Can you describe it for me?" Yes, I just did because I knew people wouldn't know what
okay.
it meant.
Sorry, I misunderstood
I'm
what you were
wrong.
describing. I thought. Sorry.
So yeah, leks are weird. They do turn up. There's not very many of them. They're not very common around big fighty things. There are a couple of antelopes and deer that do it. Which I'm not even sure there's actually reindeer might. I'd need to check. But it's not that common. It's much more common in birds. These things are always more common in birds. So loads of grouse do it. Capercaillie in the UK and Europe. These big grousey things.
They're cool.
Loads of birds
They're
of paradise
huge.
have leks. Cock of the Rock in the Andes has it. So these are around. And then the question becomes, is there an underlying ecological driver behind lekking? And that's where I would duck out and say, I don't know, but I've read at least a little bit about leks, and I don't know if there's there's probably a clear evolutionary pathway to them forming, but not necessarily a reason that they would or wouldn't in any given species, which you could then try and apply to what we know. Something like just generally being more active and aggressive in a breeding season, yeah, that's way more likely. But then the question is, do these things have a clear breeding season? And we don't know. That will vary by species, or by lineage, and it will vary by ecology and ecosystem. So again, there's no real obvious answer to that. There's probably ways of getting down to it. So if you could start looking at isotopes of eggshells or or things like pollen grains
Yeah, I
in
was
the
thinking
layers in
pollen.
which eggshells are buried, that gives you a shot at determining seasonality. So yeah, if there is a narrow window in which they tended to breed, you're going to expect more of that behavior. So things like giraffe mate all year round. There is a peak breeding season for giraffe, but it's pretty loose. Females can get pregnant in any given month and give birth in any given month. Whereas, yeah, what you'd expect in particular, of course, is animals at much higher latitudes, where it's much more seasonal and less tropical, so less even year round. There's going to be a window. These things are probably not going to lay eggs just before winter and it gets cold for 3 or 4 months. But in fact, they're probably certainly going to want to mate during winter so that they lay eggs at the start of spring so that they hatch as early as possible so the babies have got a chance to grow. If that's happening, then that's exactly what I'd expect. Very limited window for reproduction, lots and lots and lots of aggression of these animals displaying and fighting and trying to get into that gap. But I don't think
looking
anyone's
cool in the
looked at
snow
season.
with
Yeah, big sexy colors.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I
Exactly.
don't think anyone's looked at that yet. But I think we could.
Okay. I'm going to do this next question, Dave, and you're not going to get cross and you're going to listen to the whole thing, before you see, because he's going to be able to see the shortened version on the screen. Before anyway.
I'll close my eyes
Hello,
then. So
Izzy
you
and
can...
Dave. I have a lighter question for Dave. Do you have any familiarity with astrobiology? Just yesterday, and this was a while ago, this was a few days ago, scientists announced that the James Webb Telescope detected concentrations of dimethyl sulfide in the atmosphere of an ocean planet, K218b, that's 20 times the concentration found on Earth. Now, dimethyl sulfide is known to be produced only by life in large quantities. Thus, the detection of dimethyl sulfide may have been our discovery of extraterrestrial life. On a related note, I've often wondered if dinosaurs were ever stumbled upon by extraterrestrial civilizations during their 130 million year reign. Perhaps some of them were able to study and preserve dinosaurs, and to this day, non avian dinosaurs may be roaming the plains of a distant planet, waiting for humanity or its descendants to rediscover them. It's a far fetched thought, but one that still gives me a twinge of excitement. What if our best bet to bring back the dinosaurs is not trying to gather genetic traces from fossils, but exploring space? So I think this question is amazing and brilliant. And I know I can't see your face, Dave, but you're to be nice and play along.
I just it feel in the most respectful way that I can sum up. This feels like the questions I get when I do school visits to young kids, where they go, "I have a question,"
Geniuses.
and then just talk at me for 5 minutes and then sit down. And it's like, I'm not sure there was an actual question in there at any point that I was expected to answer.
The question was at the end,
Yeah,
and that is,
right.
what if our best bet to bring back the dinosaurs is not trying to gather genetic traces from fossils, but exploring space, Dave?
But what if I don't know. I don't know how to begin to answer that question.
Well, first
I
off, you
don't.
explained that we're not going to get fossils, genetic traces from fossils,
Well,
because
we're not.
that's not possible. Exactly.
Yes,
And then you
but
say,
I think the likelihood of us getting to another planet and then finding that the aliens had been around 100 million years ago, and then that they'd also visited Earth because they had faster than light travel 100 million years ago, and then they decided to bring dinosaurs over, and then they kept them for 100 million years, is collectively unlikely. And I think it's less likely than trying to get genetics out of rocks.
do you know what you are, Dave? You're a party pooper. That is
Poop it,
all
yes.
that is. I think.
So
Okay,
if we're going to ask
now,
some serious science questions, then I'm going to give you my best serious science
okay.
answer.
If you were, Dave, an alien species visiting the planet Earth 100 million years ago, what type of dinosaur would you take back to your home planet?
One
I
small
love
enough
you,
I could fit
Gutza.
it on my spaceship.
There we go,
Yeah.
Alphinosaurus.
So
Come
yeah.
on.
So we're not. Yeah. So we're not getting we're not getting titanosaurs.
No, but Alphinosaur, that would be a really bad one, actually, because it'd prise open your spacecraft, wouldn't it? Looking for ants. See?
Possibly.
Okay, we will reward him with a proper question. I just have to find it on, because it's a longer question than the one written there, although that does kind of sum it up quite nicely. Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? Where? Here we are. Pterodactyloids and the rhamphorhynchoids have quite
Pterodactyloids.
different.
Good God, we should know that by now.
What did I say?
You
What did
said
I say?
pterodactyloids. You said pero. You pronounced the P and then not the T, which is the
Shut up.
opposite of what you should be doing with a Greek word.
Yeah, but it's hard reading. It's what I literally am, a BBC broadcaster, and I cannot read. It's great. Pterodactyloids and rhamphorhynchoids have quite different bow plans in general. Do you think there was an overlap in these groups, exploiting similar niches but in different fashions, or did they always have fundamentally different lifestyles? So, how do you think this evolution worked? That's from Matthew.
So this is the bit where I say, if you haven't already, please go and read my last book, because I talk about this a bit. And in hindsight, I should probably have talked about it more, because I've already seen a paper from a colleague of mine who managed to completely misinterpret this. It's like I thought I'd cleared this up. So people really don't understand niches, or at least people writing about paleoecology, certainly for dinosaurs, really don't seem to understand basic niche basic niche ecology. So a niche overlap in particular, and then what it means for competition. So I keep seeing papers going, X and Y had different teeth, therefore they had separate niches. And that's not how niches work. Niches are about competition and about avoiding competition. So being able to live your life effectively without such serious overlap and competition from other species that you're forced out of the area or forced to go extinct. In other words, I eat these fish. They're the only fish that I can realistically eat. And all these other species also eat those fish. That's obviously kind of bad for me. I'm likely to run out of fish, particularly if they're better at catching them than I am. I'm going to go extinct. So that means you either go extinct or you move away, or you might be selected for evolutionarily to change to feed on other fish or become more efficient, etc., etc. So this is where people get it wrong, because it's not about how you do something, it's about what you're doing. So I've literally seen a bunch of papers, as I say, going, oh, well, this group's got like ridged teeth and this teeth's got like flat teeth, so they're eating, so they're not in competition. You particularly see it with the carnivores. It's like, oh, they've got, different shaped teeth. It's like, that's not how it works. The photo I've used in some of my talks is a bait ball in presumably somewhere in the Atlantic. So this is where lots of little tiny fish are all forced together by big predators. And there's whales and dolphins and sharks and big predators like tuna, big predatory fish like tuna, and then like gannets and puffins diving in to get these fish. And it's like, that's competition. That is competition. They are competing for that food. They have a niche overlap. And yet everyone would go, oh, sharks, they're not competing with dolphins. They've got different shaped teeth. It's like, no, if they're eating the same food, they're in competition. I found a paper saying that it doesn't happen that often because of the variation of prey species and cover and yada, yada, yada. But hyenas are capable of competitively excluding African hunting dogs. In other words, when spotted hyenas are doing well, Cape hunting dogs cannot survive in the same ecosystem, or at least in the same local environment. So you've got massive niche overlap. But if you looked at their heads, you'd say they're completely different animals doing different things in a different way. And they kind of are, but that doesn't mean they're not competing. So this is the misunderstanding, is just having a different body plan. I can't get a very different body plan between a humpback whale and a gannet, but they still have niche overlap and compete. So if that's going on, rhamphorhynchoids and pterodactyloids are in some places probably competing. And indeed, we know they are. Rhamphorhynchus, we know it's a fish eater, fish stomach content, found with evidence that it was probably hunting well out from shoreline, which is anything you do if you're eating fish, yada, yada, yada. We have Pterodactylus, so the almost definitive pterodactyloid with fish as stomach contents. So they're both eating fish. They're both probably eating similar fish species in the same environment at the same time. But there's going to be niche separation. Pterodactylus is probably generally focusing on smaller stuff. It's feeding closer to shoreline. That means it's probably exploiting different species. It's probably doing a bit of filter feeding or pseudo-filter feeding. So grabbing some very small stuff, and then maybe picking stuff up from rock pools that the Rhamphorhynchus isn't doing. Rhamphorhynchus is probably getting stuff like squid from open water, which won't come into the shoreline. So pterodactyls will never get hold of them. So they're going to be separate, but that doesn't mean that there's not niche overlap. In fact, I'd be amazed if there wasn't niche overlap.
Okay, I have a question which I didn't do a banner for. Sorry, Alexander, but this is Alexander. I know I missed him. He's like one of the first on my lists. So let me just read you the question. It is. I have a question for you. I was recently listening to Series 1 again, and in episode 6, Weird and
God.
Wonderful Dinosaurs, you mentioned.
I'm not going to remember what I said.
You mentioned and I'm gonna have to spell this out.
Is it
for you if I can't
Dinocyrus?
pronounce it. Yes, it is Dinocyrus. Dave talks about the arms, how the arms were found first, and the rest of the body 50 odd years later. This immediately made me think of Spinosaurus, where the neotype was described in 2014 and the tail in 2020. How confident are we that in both cases we have the same animal here and it's not a chimera? I always guessed from the arms of Deinonychus that it was
Dinochirus.
Dinochirus, that it was a oh, was it
Therizinosaur. Therizinosaur, but it
Therizinosaur?
turned
There we
out to be
go.
an ornithomimosaurid, yes. Actually, it's an ornithomimosaurid
Yes.
form, I think.
Well, anyway, yes. Is it possible that we've taken the arms of the Therizinosaur and bolted it onto the body of an Ornithomimosaur, which is onto it? And do we have a Spinosaurus body with the tail of another animal attached? If it was the case, that would be, what would the implications of that be? I'm assuming the Great Spinosaurus War will continue regardless. So basically, when you have specimens that are, examined so far apart, how do you know that they're not, two different
So,
species and they've just
so in the
muddled?
so in the case of Dinochirus, my understanding is they relocated the original site that the arms came from. Quite how, I don't know, because I don't know the story. But I also know they have multiple specimens now. So that probably clears up the overlap, because I imagine one of them has a decent hubris. The other thing to say is, at the very least, even before the discovery or rediscovery of the rest of the skeleton, most analyses were putting it out as an ornithomimosaur. So we were already finding the key characteristics in those arms that said this is definitely an ornithomimosaur and an animal, or very likely to be one. And therefore, when you find what you think is the rest of it, and it's a giant weird ornithomimosaur, well, that's probably what it's from. The Spinosaurus, it's much, much harder to say, simply because there's so much controversy around that specimen. There's questions about how it was found, because it was found by a fossil dealer. As I've been able to demonstrate with Lucibang, you've got to be very careful dealing with those people, because even when it looks genuine, it might not be. I wasn't on any of the digs. I don't know any of the people who've been out there and seen that stuff have said very clearly exactly what was found, when, by whom, and where. I know at least a couple of people have said online those legs still look weird. They look weirdly small in the neotype, like far smaller than they should be, even allowing for the various calculations that suggested Spinosaurus had small legs. So it goes all the way back to Stromer in the 1920s with, I think it's his Spinosaurus inverted commas B specimen. I can't remember off the top of my head. He went, hey, this thing's got weirdly short legs. Scott Hartman's pointed out that a bunch of the abelisaurs, when you scale them, have relatively short legs, and that in contrast, Spinosaurus, the neotype Spinosaurus, doesn't look that short, but at the same time, they do look weirdly spindly. So this is one of those things, a bit like Lucibang, really, which is, unless you get another specimen, or unless someone goes back and can really do some deep dives on something like the isotopes of the individual bones to double check that they're all from exactly, or as far as we can tell, exactly the same point and place, it's going to be somewhat questionable, which is always the problem with specimens that have come about like that. I doubt it's a chimera. I imagine that tail goes with that animal. We have an awful lot of tails for pretty much every other group going. We've never seen a tail quite like it. Spinosaurs are weird in lots of ways. It wouldn't be a surprise that it had a tail like this. I think in particular, Spinosaurus is probably free of most of the constraints of normal theropods, and therefore has probably upgraded its display structures, and therefore that would fit with the weird tail on top of the weird spines on top of the head crest. And we've now seen this bigger head crest come out of this new Niger specimen. But yeah, and until someone finds, because that's the thing, like there's this new Spinosaurus coming from Niger that we've at least heard about. We vaguely know it exists. We don't know how much of the skeleton that's been found until it's published. If that thing has a tail like this, that pretty much answers that question. But if it doesn't, well, it could just be that the Moroccan one's weird. This is always the challenge. Is like you can confirm it with the right find, but you can't disprove it with getting a different one. So what we need is an
100 of them.
uncontroversial. Well, right, but you need an uncontroversial specimen.
Yeah.
One that's fully documented and fully excavated, and that documentation is presented publicly to show. And I think finding, my understanding is some guy, some dealer, or even probably even 3 people down from a dealer, found this thing, sold it to this guy. He sold bits of it online. It was bought by 2 different research groups. The 2 research groups bought bits of it, found out that they'd each been in contact with the same guy, realized there was probably more of a skeleton there, went to Morocco and went to the site he said he got it from, dug up a bunch of bones, went back and then found the tail. I mean, that's an awful... It's at best a convoluted series of events of how the skeleton was found. So I think you can see
And your
why
reliance
people
on
are a bit...
him being accurate as to where he said he got them from, and that's the...
Yeah, which is always the big unknown.
But then there were bones there, so,
Yeah.
So he either knew there were bones there because he dug them up there, or he knew there were bones there, so he said he dug them up there.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
But we're going with the... we're saying it's not a mixture of 2 animals. It is... gut instinct says this is it.
That's the thing with the legs, is like, maybe the legs don't belong with the rest of the Neotype. That doesn't mean they're not Spinosaurus legs. You look at something
could just be
like
his baby just next door.
Well,
a younger one.
So I've there are monotaxic bone beds. There are loads and loads of places where you can dig up a whole bunch of bones, and they're all from one animal. We've just had Rebecca Hunt Foster on talking about Dinosaur National Monument, and all the different species are there. But I also mentioned the Shantungosaurus one I've done in China, which is basically just Shantungosaurus. There's the several Centrosaurus ones. There's the Coelophysis one. It's not impossible.
Yeah.
This is a place where 3 or 4 Spinosaurus died. Most of those bones are now missing, but some bits were there. So, of course, they all were living together. They all died at the same time in the same place, or very nearby, and then bits washed together on the corner of a river or bank or something like that. And you've ended up with a tail, a set of legs, most of a body, and a bunch of other bits. But it could be 5 different animals, but they're all Spinosaurus, and they're all slightly different sizes. But if you don't realize that, I mean, one of the lines of evidence they had is, well, there's no overlap. Like, we haven't found 3 legs. We haven't found, or we haven't found 2 right arms, or 2 right scapula, or, anything like this. And if you did, that would immediately raise that would immediately raise much, much bigger questions, and you'd be much, much more suspicious. In fact, you'd know that it's gone wrong, or that you've got something else here. But equally, on the other hand, when you've only got bits of 3, and you look at the skeletal diagram, there is not very much of it there. There's basically no arm material. There's basically got a tail, some legs, and a pelvis, and a bit of body. Maybe the tail and the legs and pelvis go together, and the body is from another animal. That's not that implausible. So,
okay,
I wouldn't. I think Spinosaurus is weird enough that it's all still plausible. On the other hand, if someone went back to that site and then found another leg, or again, we found a complete skeleton and the legs were much bigger, or the tail was much smaller, or something like that, I would not be very surprised either.
Amazing. Well, I really hope that that Spinosaurs are the freakiest creatures that we've ever seen, with tiny little back legs. And because then they remind me slightly of sausage dogs. And what isn't cuter than a sausage dog, really?
Well,
So,
most are.
Okay. Exactly. So I'm very sorry about the lack of video in this episode. I might just put me listening to you up. That might be quite nice for people to see. My confused face. I've no idea. But if not, apologies for that. That is because Dave's having a nightmare, and we're to be nice to you, aren't we, Dave?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you should.
Yes, exactly.
I'm lovely.
One way you can be nice to Dave is to buy his books, which you can get links to on our website. You can also go to I'll put this on the Patreon, but it is the fossilfestival.com. If you're around in the summer in Lyme Regis, you can come and see us recording a show live on a Saturday. That'll be fun. But yes, there's a link to that on the Patreon. So please do buy tickets. And what else? What else is there, Dave? Do we have anything else to say? Oh yeah, he's got a book. It's called The Cursed Tomb. You can buy that if you like. What else? Anything else?
No, no, not yet. Well, my next book has now been officially
Ooh.
released, as in I discovered a link on Amazon. So my next book,
I think
yes, my next book, which will be on Spinosaurs, written with and illustrated by Mark Whitten, will be out in the UK in November and internationally, I think January or February, but early 2026. But it is online now, so you can pre-order, etc., etc.
and you can also pre-order a copy of The Time Machine Next Door, Inventors and Dinosaurs. I wanted to call it Inventors and Pterosaurs, but they wouldn't let me. There is a dinosaur in
Because
it,
I know one
so
knows what
it's
a
fine.
pterosaur is. Yes.
Exactly, exactly. But there is one on the cover. So come on, if you want your 6 to 9-year-olds to know all about particular types of pterosaurs, this is the book to get, and also, you know, other things. But never mind. We've been wittering on for ages, and it has been absolute delight. So thank you to everybody on Patreon who has been supporting us. It really does help us. We might use it to buy Dave a new computer because this is ridiculous. And with that, we will say rar until next time. So after 3, Dave. 1, 2, 3. Oh, that was a good one. That was a good one. I like that.
Yes.